Hannah. That's what he called her, the nickname she never gave permission for, the diminutive that made her sound like someone's cheerleader instead of someone who'd held 11 Rangers alive through an ambush at Bagram. They didn't know. None of them knew what they were looking at when she moved through Sacred Heart's recovery ward at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday in late September. A 34-year-old woman in scrubs with a thin scar along her jawline and hands that never trembled, hands that had performed field thoracotomies with a combat knife when there was no scalpel, when there was only speed and muscle memory and the absolute refusal to let someone die on her watch. They didn't know that the slight figure in navy blue who smoothed bed corners with geometric precision was scanning sight lines to every door the way snipers scan horizons. That dog tag around her neck, the one on the broken chain, hidden under her collar where no one was supposed to see it, carried a rank that would make generals stand at attention. But Dr. Marcus Caldwell was about to learn that Sacred Heart had something far more dangerous than a competent night shift nurse. He just didn't know it yet. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hum as Hannah Clarke arrived at 5:06 a.m., 12 minutes before her shift officially began. The antiseptic smell hit her first, that sharp, sterile tang of bleach and saline solution that never quite masked the underneath smell of human bodies failing in increments. She'd smelled worse. She'd lived in worse. The recovery ward on the 3rd floor of Sacred Heart was a corridor of 15 patient bays, each one separated by curtains that didn't block sound, machines that beeped in irregular rhythms like a broken metronome, and the constant low hum of ventilators doing the breathing for people who couldn't do it themselves. Hannah had worked here for 3 years, ever since she'd been discharged from Walter Reed with a Purple Heart she never wore and orders to disappear into civilian life like she'd never existed at all. Officially, Major Hannah Clarke, callsign Valkyrie, no longer existed in any Pentagon database. Unofficially, she was just another nurse at Sacred Heart, pushing a cart through the pre-dawn darkness, checking 4 lines and adjusting blankets and existing in the invisible space where the work got done. She moved through Bay 1, then Bay 2, her fingers steady as she checked the central line dressing on a post-op cardiac patient, the tubing secure, the site clean and dry. No tremor. No hesitation. Her hands moved with the economy of someone who'd practiced each motion 2,000 times, which was accurate, 2,000 times in field hospitals under fire, 2,000 times in civilian trauma bays when the stakes were different but the precision required was exactly the same. Her badge hung from a lanyard, a simple photo ID that showed her name in sans serif type, H. Clarke, RN. There was a scar that ran 2 inches along her right collarbone, barely visible unless you looked, and she kept her hair in a tight bun that she could tear apart and redeploy as a tourniquet in under 4 seconds if necessary. None of this was visible unless you were looking for it. Most people weren't looking. Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrived for morning rounds at 6:15 a.m., which meant he was late, which meant he'd been in his office reviewing his investment portfolio or possibly his second cup of Ethiopian single-origin coffee that cost more per pound than Hannah's entire hourly wage. He moved through the ward like a man accustomed to the air making space for him, his white coat pressed so sharp it could cut, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a status symbol, his face arranged in the expression of someone who'd never experienced a moment of genuine doubt in his life. He was 48 years old, which meant he'd been inheriting money and advanced degrees simultaneously for the last 20 years. His father owned 3 pharmaceutical companies. His mother had a foundation. His brother-in-law was on the hospital board. The world had been arranged in his favor since birth, and he moved through it like a man who assumed it always would be. He paused at the entrance to Bay 3, where Hannah was smoothing the blanket corners with the kind of military precision that had no business appearing in civilian healthcare. The corners were parallel to the bed frame, the folds equidistant, each one made with a crispness that suggested measurement rather than intuition. She was reaching overhead to adjust the 4-pole, and when she did, the broken chain around her neck caught the fluorescent light for just a fraction of a second, a glint of metal, the edge of something stamped and official beneath her collar. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. He'd learned to notice small things because small things had made him money. A slight irregularity in quarterly projections. A competitor's hiring pattern suggesting expansion into his market. A subordinate displaying competence in a way that made them harder to dismiss. Hannah Clarke had that quality, the kind of composure that suggested she'd done something harder than this before. He made a mental note and filed it away in the same part of his mind that stored grudges. Morning rounds, he announced to no one in particular, the way men with power announce things, not a greeting, not a question, simply a statement of his presence and his intention to begin. Hannah straightened from bay 3 without hurrying, her movement smooth and controlled. If she'd heard him, she gave no indication beyond the fact that she was now positioned with perfect visibility of his approach, her body angle shifted so she could see him and the patient monitors and the hallway behind her all simultaneously. This, too, was muscle memory. Always know your exits. Always maintain situational awareness. Always position yourself to respond to threats. Caldwell reviewed the cardiac patient in bay 3 in under 2 minutes. He glanced at the chart, checked the monitor readout, asked no questions of Hannah, and moved to the next bay with the efficiency of someone who had no genuine investment in the people he was treating. She followed at the correct distance, her hands holding the chart open to the right page, her voice ready with any data he might request, her entire demeanor calibrated to the exact frequency of invisibility. This was what she'd become expert at, being present and useful and utterly forgettable. 3 years of practice. 3 years of existing in plain sight while carrying secrets that would have required security clearance to even know they existed. By bay 8, the routine had changed. This patient was 23 years old, post-op, recovering from abdominal surgery following what the chart diplomatically called a motor vehicle incident. In reality, the patient had been T-boned by a delivery truck on IR-95, and the surgeon on call, which happened to be Caldwell, had opened his abdomen and put him back together like he was assembling furniture from a kit, efficient and competent but without any of the intuitive respect that Hannah had for the fragility of human bodies. Caldwell had already written the post-op protocol that morning before he'd even arrived at the hospital, pain management on a specific schedule, mobilization beginning this afternoon, discharge trajectory aimed at Friday. It was a good protocol. It was also wrong for this patient. Hannah had been monitoring the young man since 5:50 a.m., before Caldwell arrived, before the official day had begun. She'd noticed his breathing pattern was slightly elevated. His O2 sat was 94, which was technically acceptable, but it had been 97 yesterday. His pain scores were lower than they should be given the extent of his surgery, which meant he was either heavily self-medicating or something was wrong with his perception, and she'd watched enough Rangers push through injuries to know that soldiers learned how to lie about pain the way civilians learned how to lie about their taxes. She knew his wound site had more drainage than optimal, clear and pink-tinged, suggesting he might be bleeding into the peritoneal cavity rather than out of it. She knew these things the way she knew how to strip and reassemble an M4 in complete darkness, not from theory, but from 47 months of field medicine at Bagram, from the summer she'd served as medical officer for an entire forward operating base because the actual medical officer had been medevaced, from the night she'd performed a field thoracotomy with nothing but a combat knife and the absolute certainty that if she didn't save that soldier's life in the next 8 minutes, no one would. Post-op protocol as written, Caldwell said, reviewing the chart. His voice was smooth, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd never been questioned successfully. Pain management on schedule, mobilization this afternoon, discharge Friday. Hannah waited. She waited the way people wait when they know something is wrong but they don't yet have enough room to say it. Caldwell moved toward the next bay. Doctor. Hannah's voice was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that made him stop. Not deferential. Not uncertain. Just a statement of fact, a person speaking, a sound in the room that required acknowledgement. His O2 sat was 97 yesterday. This morning it's 94. Pattern suggests atelectasis or internal bleeding. The room seemed to shift. There were 3 residents trailing Caldwell, young doctors who looked at the monitors and then at Hannah and then at Caldwell, waiting to see who was right. Caldwell's jaw tightened. It was barely perceptible, just the smallest hardening around his temples, the way a man's face looks when someone has contradicted him in front of an audience he'd assumed was entirely his own. The protocol is appropriate, he said. His voice had changed. It was still smooth, but now it was the smoothness of something sharp beneath silk. Continue as written. Hannah nodded. She nodded the way people nod when they're acknowledging what was said, not necessarily when they agree with it. She returned to the chart, her face neutral, her composure perfect, her hands steady as they had been steady, holding the femoral artery closed while waiting for a surgeon to arrive, while waiting for rescue, while holding another human being's survival in her palms and refusing to let it slip away. Caldwell's eyes had gone cold. He didn't like being questioned. More specifically, he didn't like being questioned by someone who couldn't push back without risking her employment, someone whose position made her powerless and therefore made her challenge particularly insulting. This was the calculation that moved behind his eyes, not medical concern, not curiosity about whether she might be right, but pure institutional logic. She was a nurse. He was a doctor. She was a woman in scrubs. He was a man in a white coat with a pharmaceutical empire at his back. The hierarchy existed for exactly this reason, so that people like her would understand their place and stay in it. Hannah checked the wound dressing on the post-op patient while Caldwell finished rounds in the remaining bays. She moved with practiced efficiency, her fingers gentle against inflamed skin, her assessment clinical and precise. The dressing was soaked more than optimal. The patient's forehead was beading with perspiration. His heart rate had climbed from 78 to 86 since she'd last checked it. None of this would stop Caldwell's protocol. None of this would change his mind. She'd been in the military long enough to know that hierarchy and evidence didn't always move in the same direction. But that wasn't her problem anymore. She'd given her entire adult life to a system that had decided to erase her from its records and deposit her into Philadelphia with nothing but a discharge certificate and orders to stay invisible. She could follow protocols. She could keep her head down. She could be exactly the invisible nurse that Sacred Heart thought it had hired. Or she could be ready for whatever happened next. She straightened from the bed and caught her reflection in the window, a slight woman in scrubs, hair pulled back, face composed, the broken chain of her dog tag barely visible beneath her collar where it had been for 3 years. The dog tag bore the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment and the rank that no one in this hospital was supposed to know she'd ever held. In exactly 96 hours, that would matter. For now, she folded the equipment on the medicine cart with the same precision she'd folded her military life away, each motion deliberate, each placement perfect, existing in the moment between who she had been and who she was pretending to be. The morning light crept through the windows. The monitors beeped their irregular rhythms. And somewhere in a downtown office tower, Dr. Caldwell made a mental note about the insubordinate nurse in Bay 8, already composing the first sentence of a performance review he would later use as a weapon. He had no idea what he was standing next to. The overhead page crackled across every speaker in Sacred Heart at exactly 6:38 a.m., the kind of moment that stops conversation mid-sentence. Hannah, your mess in Bay 4, Hannah. The nickname hung in the air like cigarette smoke, public, deliberate, impossible to ignore. 12 nurses heard it. The resident covering the morning shift heard it. 2 orderlies stocking the crash cart heard it. Hannah Clarke heard it and kept her eyes on the 4 line she was checking, her hand steady as a surgical laser, not even a pause in her movements. The dog tag beneath her scrub sat cold against her sternum. She had never told anyone to call her Hannah. That detail mattered. It was small enough to seem accidental, deliberate enough to be weaponized. Caldwell understood the architecture of humiliation the way some people understood music, not just the notes, but the spaces between them. The morning shift would know her by a name she hadn't chosen. By noon, the entire recovery floor would use it without thinking. Dehumanization wrapped in casual familiarity. Hannah finished the 4 check, documented the reading in the patient's chart, and moved to the next bay without acknowledgement. Her jaw had tightened for exactly half a second. That was all. No trembling. No face flushing red. No retreat to a supply closet to collect herself. Just a micro-adjustment in her breathing pattern and a continuation of rounds with the kind of mechanical precision that came from 12 years of compartmentalization, 3 tours in Bagram where you learn to absorb incoming fire and keep moving. The pages continued through the morning shift. Hannah, Bay 6 needs a Foley. Hannah, discharge paperwork in 3. Each one a small calculation in Caldwell's larger strategy. The nickname was Phase 1. Public mockery was the wedge. By week's end, the entire hospital would see her differently, not as a nurse, but as someone who had somehow earned the condescension in her name. 2 hours after the first page, Hannah was restocking the supply closet on the 3rd floor when the door closed behind her and she realized she wasn't alone. Caldwell blocked the doorway with the kind of casual power that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. His voice was surgical and cold, the same tone he used to dismiss residents during rounds. "Your performance review mentions insubordination, Hannah." He didn't move closer, didn't need to. The confined space made proximity irrelevant. "You questioned my post-op protocol in front of a resident yesterday. In front of everyone. That's not how we maintain standards here." Hannah turned to face him, hands still at shoulder height, boxes of gauze and tape arranged on the shelves behind her. Her eyes were level with his, unflinching. The silence lasted 2 seconds. "I have 3 board members on speed dial," Caldwell continued, his smile thin as a razor's edge, "who owe my family favors. They're very interested in maintaining institutional standards. Do you understand what I'm suggesting?" It wasn't a question. It was a threat wearing a doctor's coat. Hannah understood perfectly. She had seen this before, not in Philadelphia, but in different deserts, different uniforms, different languages. The architecture of power always looked the same when you'd been trained to read it. He was telling her that the hospital hierarchy was a family affair, that her position existed at the pleasure of people 3 levels above her, that questioning his competence was the same as questioning the entire structure that kept her employed. She met his eyes without blinking and spoke in a voice like steel wrapped in silk, low enough that only he could hear. "You're confusing authority with competence, Doctor. One day you'll learn the difference." The words landed exactly where she intended. Caldwell's face flushed, a dark crimson that climbed from his collar line, his jaw tightening as if he was grinding teeth that hadn't actually moved. For 3 seconds, the supply closet belonged to someone other than him. Hannah had taken that space and held it, not through volume or aggression, but through the absolute certainty of someone who had already survived worse than whatever institutional punishment he could orchestrate. He stepped back. Not far, but enough. "You're finished here," he said, voice still controlled, but the control was fraying at the edges. "Be grateful I'm not making an example of you." Hannah turned back to the shelves without responding, continuing to arrange supplies with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything. Caldwell left. The door closed. She had maybe 4 hours before the consequences crystallized into something permanent. That evening, as the night shift arrived in a steady stream through the parking lot, Caldwell found her at her car. The sun was dropping behind the Philadelphia skyline, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and he was holding a piece of paper that looked remarkably like official hospital letterhead. He handed it to her with a smile that had been practiced in front of mirrors. Around them, incoming nurses slowed their pace, pretending not to notice the interaction that was clearly meant to be witnessed. The demotion notice was printed on cream-colored stock, the kind hospitals used for documents that required permanence. "Effective immediately," Caldwell said, loud enough for the arriving shift to hear, "you're reassigned to janitorial support. Perhaps cleaning bedpans will teach you the respect that nursing school apparently didn't." His smile widened like he had just delivered a clever joke. A resident walking past covered her mouth. 2 nurses looked away. One of them was someone Hannah had worked beside for 18 months. Hannah took the paper, folded it once with absolute precision, and looked at the man who had just systematically dismantled her professional position in front of an audience. She said nothing. Words would have given him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she opened her car door, placed the notice on the passenger seat, and started the engine with the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly how much you can survive. The dog tag cold against her chest. She drove out of the Sacred Heart parking lot at 6:13 p.m., past the incoming night shift, past Caldwell standing in the lot with his practice smile beginning to fade because she hadn't given him what he wanted: anger, tears, capitulation. Just silence and the sound of her car radio clicking off as she turned onto the access road toward the city, and by that evening, the entire recovery floor was calling her Hannah without irony, without question, just the way things were done around Sacred Heart when you were a janitor who had somehow questioned a Caldwell. But at 9:02 p.m., everything changed. The emergency department received a trauma admission that would rewrite the next 72 hours of Hannah's life. A 250-pound Army Ranger, Staff Sergeant Derek Hayes, arrived via ambulance from Fort Dix after a training accident involving a structural collapse. He was unconscious, his uniform soaked with blood, vitals unstable and sliding in the wrong direction. The unit patch on his duffel bag showed 75th Ranger Regiment. Dark Horse Battalion. Caldwell took the case personally despite the late hour, which meant the Rangers had institutional importance he could weaponize for his board presentation. Strategic thinking. Always strategic thinking. But what he didn't know was that Hannah had been folding linens in the basement laundry when the code came through the overhead system, and her hands had gone completely still for half a heartbeat when she heard 75th Ranger in the paramedics' report crackling through the speakers. 12 years. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. She had left that life carefully, deliberately, walking into Sacred Heart as someone with no military background, no classified past, just a nurse with steady hands and the kind of quiet competence that made her invisible to people like Caldwell. The Rangers had a way of finding you anyway. The transport came through the ER doors at 8:53 p.m. 2 paramedics wheeling a stretcher, their movements urgent but controlled, their radio chatter clipped and professional. Male, mid-30s, unconscious, breath sounds diminished on the left side, GCS-3, unresponsive to pain. The Ranger uniform was visible beneath the trauma blanket, army fatigues, mudcake boots, the green and gold shoulder patch of the 75th Ranger Regiment visible for exactly 2 seconds before the stretcher turned the corner toward Bay 7. Hannah was restocking the crash cart when she heard the radio transmission. Her hand stilled on the equipment tray. Her eyes followed the paramedics down the hallway, and her breath caught somewhere deep in her chest in a place she thought she'd sealed off 3 years ago. That patch. That exact patch. That was her unit patch. That was the insignia of the platoon she used to command. She didn't move. Didn't call out. Didn't run. The code of the invisible was to remain invisible, and she had been so good at it. She had walked these corridors for 3 years, through 2,000 shifts, through 10,000 moments of competence that she carefully never showcased, through every institutional humiliation Caldwell could manufacture, all to stay exactly where she was, unknown, unbothered, untethered to the woman she used to be. But that patch. That was the 75th Ranger Regiment. That was her boys. Hannah moved without deciding to move. Her feet carried her toward Bay 7 on the logic of protocols, checking in, ensuring the patient was stable, the way any competent nurse would. But her hands trembled as she stepped toward the glass partition, just enough to see the stretcher. The Ranger's face was slack, unconscious. Dark hair, strong jaw, the kind of solid build that came from 8 years of conditioning. She didn't recognize him. The panic that thought triggered was sharper than she expected. A resident named Chen was already there, running the initial assessment. Caldwell emerged from the adjacent bay, his white coat fluttering like a cape as he approached, already issuing orders before he'd even reached the bedside. "Get an EKG running," Caldwell said. "Start a second 4. Type and cross." The nurses moved. Hannah stayed near the doorway, telling herself she was just observing, just ensuring continuity of care. She was just a nurse. Just invisible. The Ranger's monitors showed elevated heart rate, 132, climbing. His oxygen sat at 91%. The paramedic had marked the left side of his chest with diminished breath sounds, and as Hannah watched, her mind already cataloging, already calculating, his breathing became more labored. "Expand the chest X-ray," Caldwell ordered. "He's probably got a hemothorax." The resident moved too slowly. The equipment took time to position. And then the Ranger's chest began to heave. His back arched. His body went rigid. His lips turned blue not gradually but instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. The monitors spiked. Heart rate 178. Oxygen sat 67 and falling. His face contorted, jaw clenched so tight his muscles bulged like wires beneath his skin. Seizure. But not from the head injury. This was something else. Something more acute. Sedate him, Caldwell said, his voice already uncertain. The monitors climbed. 64, 61. 59, each number was a countdown. Get an airway kit, Chen said. We need to intubate. Caldwell stepped back from the bed. His hands hovered uselessly in the air. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Wait. We should get a CT first. We don't know if he has. He's dropping, Hannah said. The words came out before thought, before permission, before she could stop the voice that belonged to someone she'd buried. Tension pneumothorax. Left side. He's occluding. Caldwell's eye snapped to her. His face flushed. Nurse, this is my patient. Hannah was already moving. The crash cart was 6 steps away. The 14-gauge needle was in its red wrapper, exactly where it always was. She stripped the plastic as she walked, her fingers remembering a different kind of crisis, a different kind of speed. The needle gleamed like a promise. Stop, Caldwell said. His voice rose. I don't authorize that procedure. The ranger's oxygen sat was 52. His chest no longer rose with breath. The seizure had stopped, but he'd stopped breathing too, his body betraying him, his lungs collapsed on themselves like punctured balloons. Hannah's hands moved like they'd moved in Bagram when there was no time for protocols, no time for authorization, no time for anything but the calculus of survival. She palpated the ranger's chest, counting ribs with fingers that remembered this exact motion through dust and noise and the screams of younger soldiers. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. You'll kill him, Caldwell said. His words were contradiction stacked on contradictions. Stop. Now. That's an order. Someone get her away from the patient. The needle went in. Not with hesitation. Not with doubt. With the kind of precision that came from having done it before when the difference between success and failure was a body bag. The needle slid between the cartilage of the second and third ribs with perfect geometry. The hiss was immediate. Audible. The sound of air pressure equalizing, of life returning to physics instead of chaos. The ranger's chest expanded. Symmetrical. Perfect. His monitors beeped once. Twice. Then settled into rhythm. Oxygen sat climbed. 55, 62. 71, 84. His color returned like someone had turned the blood back on. His lips went from blue to pale to the pink of living tissue. His heart rate dropped from 178 to 132 to 104. The seizure stopped. The crisis stopped. The bay went silent except for the ventilator and the steady percussion of the monitor. Hannah adjusted his oxygen mask. Checked his pupils. Turned to the resident. He'll need a chest tube. Left side. Get surgery down here. Chen nodded, already moving. Already understanding that orders had been given by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Caldwell stepped backward. His face had gone pale beneath his perpetual tan. His eyes were flat now, calculating, running equations in that perfect brain of his. This nurse had just performed a needle decompression without authorization. This nurse had just contradicted him in front of a resident. This nurse had just saved a patient's life in exactly the way that made administrators nervous and protocols questionable and hierarchies uncertain. You performed a procedure without physician authorization, Caldwell said. His voice was quiet now, surgical in its coldness. That's grounds for immediate termination. Possibly criminal charges. Hannah looked at him. She didn't blink. She didn't defend. She didn't explain. She just said, her voice carrying the weight of understanding that came from having commanded soldiers, someone who believed saving lives mattered more than protocol. She walked toward the door. Toward the laundry room. Toward the place where she still belonged, invisible and competent and absolutely expendable to people like Caldwell. Her hands trembled as she gripped the counter in the laundry room. Just slightly. Just enough to feel the weight of the choice she'd made, the exposure she'd allowed, the future she'd just rewritten by refusing to let someone die. The dog tag burned against her skin like a brand. The broken chain held it in place, a weight she'd carried for 3 years, waiting for exactly this moment when anonymity would become the more dangerous choice than truth. By noon, Caldwell had dismantled her entire institutional foundation with the efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. Her floor supervisor, a woman named Patricia who'd mentored Hannah for 2 years, received reassignment orders to the cardiac wing without explanation. Patricia tried to find Hannah before the transfer took effect, but Caldwell had already moved her to a schedule that eliminated all overlap. The message was clear: isolation first, erasure second. Next week's roster arrived in Hannah's email at 11:51 a.m. 7 days of shifts she'd been promised, gone. Not replaced, deleted entirely. The schedule showed her name crossed out in red, her hours redistributed to 3 nurses who weren't qualified for the recovery ward's critical cases. The fluorescent lighting of the break room seemed to hum louder as she stared at the blank spaces where her name used to be, her hand steady, her breathing measured. Other nurses avoided her eyes. They'd already heard the rumors Caldwell had planted: reckless, dangerous, a cowboy playing doctor. By 1 p.m., hospital administration had received 3 separate calls from Dr. Marcus Caldwell, each one calculated and precise. The first call cited the dangerous protocol violations and patient safety concerns. The second mentioned precedent-setting liability and referenced a vague incident that he suggested required investigation. The third call was the kill shot. He had witnesses, he said, though he never named them. He had documentation, though the timestamps didn't match the actual events. He had a narrative, and he'd built it from the moment Hannah's needle went into that ranger's chest. The calls moved upward through the administrative hierarchy with the momentum of a stone rolling downhill. By 1:45 p.m., the chief administrator had reviewed fabricated incident reports, altered timestamps, and carefully coached statements. The narrative was complete. Major Hannah Clarke, though they didn't know the rank, was a liability. The hospital's legal department had already drafted the termination letter. Security arrived at the recovery ward at 2:03 p.m. Not angry, not aggressive, just efficient. 2 men in Navy uniforms with the bearing of people who'd done this before, who'd cleared hundreds of rooms and never once questioned the paperwork. One of them was named Torres, and he looked uncomfortable as he approached Hannah at Bay 9, where she was checking me for lying on a post-op patient recovering from abdominal surgery. Ms. Clarke. Not Hannah. Not nurse. Just the surname, clinical and distant. You need to come with us. She didn't flinch. She didn't pause mid-check. Her hands continued their work, smooth and practiced, the for running clear and steady. Only when she'd finished did she turn to face them, her badge still clipped to her scrubs, the ID photo showing a woman with no expression and no history. Now, she asked. Now, Torres confirmed. His voice suggested he'd prefer to be anywhere else. The walk to the administrator's office took 3 minutes. Hannah passed Dr. Caldwell in the hallway. He was speaking to a resident about post-operative complications, his voice light and confident, his hand gesturing as if nothing had changed. He didn't look at her. That was the cruelest part, not the acknowledgement, but the complete and utter erasure. She'd ceased to exist the moment her hands had moved faster than his thought process. The administrator's office smelled like new carpet and expensive coffee. A woman named Patricia Vance, no relation to Hannah's former supervisor, sat behind an oversized desk with the termination letter already printed. Hannah's badge was on the desk beside it. Deactivated. The status light that should have glowed green now showed nothing. Ms. Clarke, we're going to need your badge and your access card, Patricia said, not meeting her eyes. Your employment with Sacred Heart is terminated effective immediately. You're to vacate the premises within 15 minutes. Security will escort you to your locker. Hannah didn't ask why. She didn't argue. She reached for the badge, unpinned it from her scrubs with one smooth motion, and set it on the desk. The weight of it, so small, so light, seemed to echo as it landed on the polished wood. She signed the termination paperwork in blue ink, each letter precise and controlled, her signature matching the one from 3 years ago when she'd first arrived at Sacred Heart with a fabricated nursing degree and a destroyed military ID. The only copy of her actual records lived in a Pentagon database marked classified and inactive. Major Hannah Clarke officially didn't exist. The Army had erased her after she testified against General Marcus Brennan in a closed military tribunal about weapons trafficking in Helmand Province, millions of dollars in military hardware moving to insurgent groups with the general's knowledge and protection. She'd been 3 days away from a court-martial that would never happen, 3 days away from witness protection that came with a condition: disappear completely. Never surface. Never tell anyone. Let the Army bury the scandal along with her career. For 3 years, she'd been buried. She'd been invisible. And invisibility was supposed to keep her alive. Security walked her to her locker in silence. Torres held out a plastic bin. Hannah removed her stethoscope, her trauma shears with the worn leather grip, the surgical gloves she kept in the side pocket. At the bottom of the locker, wrapped in a washcloth, was the single dog tag on its broken chain. She'd kept it against federal protocol, against every instruction. She held it for 1 second, the metal warm from sitting in darkness for 3 years, and then she placed it in the bin. Everything a nurse needs goes in one plastic container. "I'm sorry," Torres said quietly as they walked to the exit. "I'm not here to judge, but I will say, whatever you did in that bay, you saved his life. Everyone knows it." Hannah didn't respond. Silence was its own kind of power. They reached the staff exit at 2:18 p.m., and Torres held the door open. Outside, Philadelphia rain hammered the loading dock like applause, or maybe like artillery, or maybe like both at once. She stepped into it and didn't look back. That night, at midnight, she used her old keycard, the one that still worked on the service entrances, the one they never thought to deactivate because no one even knew it existed, and slipped into Sacred Heart's industrial laundry facility through the basement. The fluorescent lights flickered their familiar rhythm. Machines hummed. And on a folding table in the corner, she placed her scrubs, every set she'd worn for 3 years, and began folding them one final time. Her hands moved with precision. Each crease aligned. Each sleeve tucked. Each collar pressed flat. These hands had once commanded a ranger platoon of 43 soldiers through hostile territory in the Hindu Kush Mountains. These hands had performed emergency surgery with a combat knife and morphine and prayers. These hands had held dying men and whispered that medevac was coming and knew, with absolute certainty, that it was a lie. And now these hands folded scrubs in an empty laundry room at midnight, accepting this final indignity because anonymity had been her only mission for 3 years. She placed the dog tag, the one piece of her past she'd kept, the one piece of evidence that Major Hannah Clarke had ever existed, inside the breast pocket of the last folded set. The metal felt warm again, or maybe that was her imagination. Maybe that was 3 years of tension finally releasing itself, or maybe it was the beginning of something else entirely. She left the scrubs stacked on the counter, arranged in perfect rows, each one identical to the last. Then she walked toward the loading dock, past the dumpsters and flickering emergency lights, carrying nothing. The rain had stopped. The city was silent in that particular way Philadelphia gets at 3 in the morning, not peaceful, but waiting. She had no apartment to return to. No forwarding address. No life outside of Sacred Heart. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that somewhere in a classified Pentagon database, someone had been waiting for Major Hannah Clarke to slip up, to surface, to make contact with her former unit. And in 24 hours, when Staff Sergeant Hayes woke up in Bay 7 and told his commanders that the nurse who'd saved his life moved like a ranger, fought like a ranger, and handled a needle decompression with the precision of a combat medic, that database would light up like a Christmas tree. The dog tag in the breast pocket of the folded scrub, left behind in a hospital laundry facility at 3 in the morning, was about to become the most important piece of evidence in federal law enforcement history. The Black Hawk's rotor wash shook the windows on the 7th floor at 5:40 in the morning. Glass rattled in frames. Coffee cups vibrated across the nurse's station. 2 rangers in dress uniform walked straight past the security desk, no badges, no check-in, no questions asked because the way they moved made people step aside without thinking. Boots on polished tile. Measured. Deliberate. The kind of pace that announced they weren't asking for permission. They went directly to the administrator's office on the 4th floor. Found her reviewing budget spreadsheets in the pre-dawn quiet. The senior ranger, call sign Breaker, set a classified file on her desk with the careful precision of someone placing a live ordnance. We need Major Clarke. Call sign Valkyrie. She was terminated from this facility yesterday under false pretenses while operating under federal protection. You're going to reverse that immediately, or we're doing this with lawyers and federal marshals. Your choice. The administrator's hands went cold. She'd signed the termination paperwork. She'd authorized security to deactivate Hannah's badge. She'd done exactly what Dr. Caldwell had requested without asking a single question. Downstairs, Caldwell was already in his office, already crafting the narrative. He'd been awake since 3 in the morning, rehearsing his story, polishing the details. Security breach. Rogue employee. Dangerous protocol violation. By noon, local news would run it. By the evening, it would be contained. He'd saved the hospital. He'd protected patients. He'd done exactly what any competent administrator would do when faced with an unlicensed practitioner operating outside established procedure. He didn't hear the elevator arrive on his floor. Didn't hear the heavy footfalls or the administrator's voice, tight with panic, saying his name into the hallway phone. The first indication that something had shifted was when his office door opened without a knock and 2 rangers in dress uniform stepped inside, bringing with them a kind of charged silence that made the fluorescent light seem dim by comparison. Caldwell stood. Forced a smile. Gentlemen, I'm not sure what this is about, but... Sit down, Breaker said. Not a request. Caldwell Saturday. The second ranger, older, with ribbons that told stories of 23 years and command decisions that had meant life or death, opened the file. His voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that carries authority like a blade. Major Hannah Clarke. Silver Star for Valor at Bagram. Purple Heart. Second Purple Heart. Distinguished Service Cross. She pulled 11 rangers out of a complex ambush while taking shrapnel to the right shoulder and femoral artery. Did a field thoracotomy with a combat knife because the situation required it. Kept all 11 soldiers alive until medevac arrival. Caldwell's face went white. Not pale. Not flushed. The specific white of someone watching their entire constructed reality collapse in real time. She came to Sacred Heart 3 years ago on federal assignment. Protected status. Medical work. Low profile. She wasn't supposed to be noticed. Wasn't supposed to be remarkable. Just another nurse working double shifts and saving lives quietly. The ranger's eyes never left Caldwell's face. Then you decided she was a threat to your authority. You used your position to systematically dismantle her career. You fabricated protocol violations. You made calls to board members. You terminated her employment while she was operating under a direct Pentagon mandate. And now you're going to explain to a federal review board why you did those things. I didn't know, Caldwell's voice cracked. That's the problem, the ranger said. You didn't look. You saw someone who questioned you in front of a resident and decided she needed to be erased. You didn't ask questions. You just acted. That's not leadership, Doctor. That's cowardice. By that afternoon, the hospital's legal team had discovered everything. The altered shift schedules. The backdated performance review. The witness statements Caldwell had coached, each one timestamped in his calendar app. Every move he'd made to destroy Hannah became evidence in a paper trail that couldn't be denied. The board members who owed his family favors suddenly stopped answering their phones. When their lawyers called back, it was only to say they had no comment and would be cooperating fully with the federal investigation. Caldwell didn't handle it the way a smart man would have. A smart man would have called his lawyer and stayed silent. Instead, Caldwell decided that the story needed to be managed, controlled, shaped in his favor while he still had the platform and the credibility. At 6 o'clock that evening, he sat in the studio of Philadelphia's largest news station, every line of his face arranged into the expression of a concerned professional. His tie was navy. His watch was a Rolex. His hair was perfect. His pharmaceutical air confidence was still visible to anyone not looking closely enough to see that his hands had stopped shaking only because he'd gripped the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles had gone white. The anchor smiled at him with the practiced warmth of someone about to do violence with civility. "Thank you for being here, Doctor. Walk our viewers through what happened yesterday at Sacred Heart Hospital." Caldwell leaned forward slightly, the gesture of someone prepared to share a difficult truth. "We have protocols at Sacred Heart for a reason. Patient safety. Credential verification. Adherence to established procedure. Yesterday we discovered that an employee had been providing medical care without proper authorization. She performed a dangerous intervention on a patient using techniques that, while perhaps well-intentioned, fell outside our standard operating procedures. I made the difficult but necessary decision to terminate her employment immediately. This hospital has standards, and I acted to protect patient safety." The anchor nodded. "And you performed an investigation before taking action?" "Absolutely. I reviewed the incident personally. The evidence was clear. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed everything." The anchor's earpiece activated. She touched her finger to it, listening, and her expression shifted into something harder. "We have a Pentagon spokesperson on the line. We're going to take that live." Caldwell's jaw tightened by exactly 1 millimeter. The voice that filled the studio was military crisp, filtered through a secure federal line, and it carried the weight of institutional authority that made Caldwell's television presence look like community theater. "Major Hannah Clarke is a decorated Army officer currently assigned to a protected federal recovery program at Sacred Heart Hospital under a direct Pentagon mandate. Dr. Caldwell knowingly terminated her employment while she was operating under classified federal assignment." Caldwell's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Staff Sergeant Derek Hayes arrived at Sacred Heart Hospital in respiratory distress with a tension pneumothorax. He was in cardiac arrest. "Your emergency protocols failed. Major Clarke's intervention, a needle decompression using a 14-gauge angiocath at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, saved his life. This procedure is standard combat medical training. It exceeded your hospital's protocols because your hospital has never trained for combat trauma." Dr. Caldwell was present during this intervention. He chose to interpret an act of heroism as a threat. The camera focused on Caldwell's face. Millions of people were watching him realize that the hierarchy he'd wielded like a weapon could be wielded against him. "We have recordings of Dr. Caldwell threatening Major Clarke. We have documentation of falsified performance reviews, altered work schedules, and coached witness statements. His medical license is under federal review. Criminal charges for witness intimidation and retaliation against a federal asset are being prepared. The United States military does not forget people who betray its people." The line went dead. Caldwell sat in the studio lights for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. The anchor didn't say anything. The cameraman didn't move. The entire Philadelphia market held its breath, watching a man learn what it meant to lose the infrastructure that had allowed him to destroy others. By the next morning, Sacred Heart's board had suspended him pending investigation. His office was cleared out. His access badge was deactivated. His mail would be forwarded to his attorney. The board members who'd promised him favors were now testifying against him to save themselves, each deposition carefully timed to demonstrate that they'd been misled, deceived, manipulated by a man they'd never really known. His phone rang constantly. Calls he couldn't answer. Calls from lawyers, from former colleagues, from the pharmaceutical company that had been considering a consulting position until they ran a federal background check and learned about the criminal investigation. 6 months later, Hannah Clarke walked into the Philadelphia VA hospital wearing her major insignia, her service record finally visible, her name finally acknowledged. The combat trauma unit she led was the best-performing trauma unit on the East Coast, not because she was exceptional at hiding, but because she was exceptional at saving lives, and now her team knew exactly who they were following. Staff Sergeant Hayes came for his 6-month checkup, walking without assistance, moving like a man who'd been given a second chance at living. He shook her hand with the grip of someone who understood what her silence had cost. "Welcome home." She nodded. Said nothing. Didn't need to. The way she moved through her department was different now. There was no anonymity in her stride. There was authority, earned through action, through competence, through the specific kind of quiet that comes from having already survived the worst. Caldwell, meanwhile, had discovered that a pharmaceutical fortune and a suspended medical license didn't open many doors. He'd tried consulting. That lasted 3 weeks. He'd tried joining a private practice. The partners did a background check and withdrew the offer within 24 hours. By month 4, he'd taken a job at a strip mall near Roosevelt Boulevard, selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table that he set up every morning at 9 and took down every evening at 6. A former Sacred Heart nurse walked past his table one Tuesday in October. She was getting coffee at the place next door when she noticed him, tie still knotted carefully, smile still practiced, hand extended with too much eagerness. "Hey, remember me? Sarah Chen, from the cardiac unit? I've got some great options for supplemental coverage. Let me just show you." She kept walking. That evening, Hannah attended a VA fundraiser where a young combat medic pulled her aside in a quiet corner near the window overlooking the Philadelphia skyline. "How did you do it?" the medic asked. "How did you work here 3 years without anyone knowing? How did you stay silent when he was destroying you?" Hannah touched the dog tag she now wore openly, the one that had been left behind in a hospital laundry facility and had set off a cascade that ended careers, protected reputations, and vindicated a woman who'd simply been doing her job with the competence of someone trained to save lives in the worst places on earth. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," Hannah said quietly. "I wasn't here to be noticed. I was here to be useful. That's enough." The medic nodded, understanding in the way that only people who'd served could understand. That competence doesn't need an audience. That real authority comes from action, not position. That the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous because they're too busy working to waste time on ego. Through the window, the Philadelphia skyline glowed against the evening sky, and Hannah returned to her patients, soldiers who knew exactly what her silence had cost and what her presence meant. They trusted her not because of her rank, but because of what she'd done when it mattered. Because she'd chosen to save a stranger's life instead of protecting her cover. Because she'd chosen competence over authority. Caldwell sat in his apartment that same night, scrolling through LinkedIn job postings he was overqualified for but couldn't get. His pharmaceutical fortune had been tied up in legal settlements. His medical license wouldn't be reinstated for more years, if ever. He understood now, in the specific way that only someone who'd lost everything could understand, that he'd confused his position with his worth. He'd believed the hierarchy was something he'd created, something he controlled, something he could weaponize. He'd never considered that it was something that could turn on him the moment he used it wrong. The dog tag that should have disappeared in a hospital laundry facility had instead become a beacon, a signal, a final proof of Hannah Clarke's identity and sacrifice. It had brought the Pentagon to Philadelphia. It had brought federal review boards to Sacred Heart. It had brought the entire infrastructure of military accountability down on a man who'd believed himself untouchable because of his name and his connections. Hannah had won, but she'd won the way soldiers win, not with triumph, but with survival. Not with vindication, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she'd stayed true to her mission even when staying silent would have been easier. If you've made it this far, you know there's a story here that matters. Subscribe to see more hidden heroes who changed everything when no one was watching. Like this video if you believe real authority comes from competence, not titles. And comment below, what would you have done in Hannah's position? Stay dangerous out there.